Hello, and welcome to another episode of Enchanting Economics in New Mexico. This podcast is a production of bber, the recognized expert in socioeconomic data for the state of New Mexico. Your hosts, as always, are myself, Rayanne McKernan, alongside Sarun Lytle. We did an episode about uranium mine cleanup last year. So this will be part 2 in the series on uranium mine cleanup. bber conducted a project about this subject for over a year and a half and recently published its findings. Joining us today is one of the authors of the report, Rose Rohrer. Thanks for joining us, Rose.
Hi, glad to be here.
So you, along with Dr. Jeff Mitchell and John B. Tech, are the primary authors of this report that you called The Economic Opportunities and Challenges of Uranium Mine Cleanup in New Mexico. It was a huge report, and the most exciting things that came out of it for me was the recommendation that mine remediation could be made into a key industry for our state. I think that's really cool, but how is that actually a possibility?
Well, Rayanne, it's an interesting question. In New Mexico, we don't have any active uranium mines at this time, but we have a lot of folks who are working in the uranium mine industry. So we have a lot of trained workers who have the skills to work with radioactive materials, who have the skills and ability to go in and do this kind of work, taking stuff out of the ground. But what we're left with no active mines, is a whole lot of damage to the landscape and damage to people's communities. With no jobs in uranium mine extraction at this time, what we found in our study was that those people who have the skills to do the mining and do the extraction also could have the skills to work on the cleanup activities. All we need in New Mexico is a slight repositioning of how we train these workers so that we can start addressing environmental remediation as an industry, especially as we move out of the extractive economy to a degree.
And I read in your report that New Mexico has approximately 1,100 uranium mines and sites, most of which have no remediation actions taken yet. Is that number as big as it seems? And do other states have such a big problem like this? Or at least what seems big to me. And I guess the last thing on that is there a potential for New Mexico to make a name for itself in this industry, considering the massive scale? I mean, could this potentially be something that gets us opportunities nationally or even globally?
You're right, it's a massive problem. And it is focused in the Four Corners region, but there are uranium mines nationally and globally. At one point in the uranium mine industry's history, the Grants Uranium Belt in New Mexico was the largest producer of uranium at that time globally. So this is a massive problem for our state, but it does go across other states, and Arizona has many unremediated uranium mines as well. And in our report, we look at mines, but there are also issues with drill sites, with mill sites, drill, mill, to be very clear on this podcast. But these are things that we didn't even look at. These are exploratory activities, or the milling activities, and what was left behind with those. So if we could develop environmental remediation as an industry, specifically with a focus on radioactive materials, we would have opportunities not only to do the cleanup work that so desperately needs to be done in our own state, but across the region, across the state, and globally, should we build the industry largely enough over time. It also goes beyond uranium. If we thought of environmental remediation as its own industry, this could not only include radioactive materials, but other extractive industries that leave behind legacy mines and potential contaminants that are not radioactive or hazardous. And that is an even larger industry. On that, cleaning up a uranium mine can be anything from building roads to get there, to get the equipment there to do the cleanup, to hauling materials away, to handling materials, to assessing the plants in the area, to assessing the contamination to watersheds. So these types of jobs will range from construction to engineering jobs and everything in between. Environmental remediation needs to be considered as a complete industry, from blue-collar jobs working with yellow iron to the white-collar professional jobs that do the assessments that are necessary to clean this stuff up.
Wow. I honestly did not realize how much goes into this. I mean, it's humongous. I'm a little surprised we haven't already created this as a key industry here.
It was impressive to see the number of different jobs that can be created through the cleanup of these sites.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if creating this new industry in New Mexico actually comes to fruition, do we have the people who can do these jobs?
We both do and we don't. And that's where our recommendations for the state come in. What we have in New Mexico is the base level for all of this to be built off of. We have universities from Diné College to New Mexico Tech to UNM to Navajo Technical University to NMSU and beyond, working on these issues. San Juan College, we've talked with all of these universities and professional training programs, and there's innovation going on in our state. There's training going on, but the matching of skills with jobs and the trainings that are specific to actually working with these materials on the ground are not always present. And so one of the things that we looked at is how could the state intervene to do better matching, to have more collaboration. We have LANL and we have Sandia Labs. We have all these amazing resources within the state. Pooling them into an effort to clean up these mines would be revolutionary in a lot of ways and could develop into an industry, because we do have the willing workers here. We have people with the base level skills. There just needs to be a little bit better matching and a slight repositioning of those skills according to what we found in the study.
And so recently I heard someone present on the topic of uranium, and he said something that really got me thinking. He said that Navajo Nation, and I realize obviously Navajo Nation is more than just an area of New Mexico, that it roughly is the same size as the state of West Virginia. And then he said that there are roughly 250 grocery stores in West Virginia, but just 16 on the land, on nation land. And to me, that's mind-blowing. And I can't help but wonder, if we do make remediation an actual industry, could that lead to employment boosts in other sectors within New Mexico communities?
Definitely there could be a ripple effect, especially in the area of Northwest New Mexico. That's where the majority of these mines are located. It's where the majority of the work would be done. And when you have people coming into an area to do work, and this is generations of work, there's so much cleanup to be done, there's generations of work to be done. And you have people coming into these areas, they're going to need restaurants and housing and grocery stores and infrastructure, things like internet, things that could improve that area as well. The access to resources like grocery stores in that area as well. It has the potential to do those things.
So one last thing that I want to ask you to touch on are the challenges that you mentioned in the report. And like I touched on a little, the report is massive, but anyone who wants to actually read through it is more than welcome to. It's available on our website at bber.unm.edu/uranium. And you lay out the recommendations, and they're broken down into 4 categories that are discussed in the constraint section. Is it possible for you to summarize the constraints, or maybe it would be better to ask you if there is a key source of action that is crucial to the success of this industry in New Mexico?
Well, I want to address 2 main constraints, I think. more might come up too, because there were quite a few constraints on developing this industry and really getting things rolling. One that we found to be perhaps the most time-consuming of the constraints, but maybe one that could be resolved without too much monetary input from the state, is the lack of communication. Agency to agency, from the federal government to the Navajo Nation to the state government to agencies within the state government, there wasn't a lot of transparency. There wasn't always good information sharing. It doesn't mean that people didn't want to share the information. It's just there wasn't a centralized space to share information. So for example, the locations of the mines, it took a lot of work to get the right database to put into a map, to even talk about the way in which these mines were dispersed. Now, there have been studies done on these mines. They've been surveyed, but not everybody has access to the maps or the database or the information about the surveys in a meaningful way that they can read and understand. And so this lack of communication and a lack of unified vision, bringing all the stakeholders to the table to have the conversations about what needs to be done, is impeding our ability to move forward with the recommendations that we discuss in our report. The other constraint that I think is important to address is that our report doesn't suggest ways that the state can get more money to do the actual cleanup. What our report suggests is that there will be more actions to clean up these mines, and there need to be actions. Communities are being poisoned. This is a massive issue, but without money flowing in to do the cleanup actions, there wouldn't be a purpose for an environmental remediation industry. However, if we don't have an environmental remediation industry, then other companies can come in from other states, from other places, and scoop up all these very lucrative contracts to do work like building roads, to do work like moving materials, to do the engineering and the assessment work. And what we suggest is that the state develop this up so that we can benefit as New Mexicans from these contracts as best as possible.
Bringing in outside companies is definitely something that we in New Mexico should try to avoid. It seems like developing jobs and creating jobs for people in this area, especially those people who have been living there and dealing with this for decades, seems only fair or right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that was the purpose of the study, is that so often what we see is this money comes in from the outside. And the EPA got a nearly $1 billion contract to clean up mines on and near the Navajo Nation just recently. That money is being spent as we speak, and the contracts are going to corporations who bid to the EPA. Now, if New Mexico were in a position to make bids on those contracts, we would see the economic benefits come back to us. But additionally, it's important to know the nature of the space that we're in. And so I'm reminded of this story that we heard a number of times when we were doing the research, where a company had been contracted to come in for some uranium mine cleanup activities, and they were contracted to build a bridge across an arroyo. And they built this bridge across the arroyo, even though the local people had said, no, that's not a good place, that floods so heavily in the summer. And this is a company from outside of the desert Southwest. No, they say they're going to build this bridge, it's going to be fine. So what happens the first monsoon season? The bridge washes out. And it's because of the lack of experience in the land and working with the people who know the land that these kinds of things can happen. Now, if New Mexican workers were able to secure a contract like that, potentially they would be able to know our landscape better, in addition to bringing the benefits back to New Mexico and benefiting the local people. It's a big issue.
It is a big issue. And honestly, like, I'm surprised that we haven't done this sooner, you know?
I know that they've tried. I mean, this research that we did was funded through the state, and it had been proposed a number of times before it actually went through and was funded. And at that, it was funded at a slightly lower level. So we were only able to look at workforce and economic impact issues, whereas there are additional issues like people's livelihoods, the breakup of communities who are relocated because they can't live near this contamination anymore. And that breaks apart community ties. Also, other issues such as looking at the health impacts and the cost of those health impacts. Those are all things that we could talk about in this report that would benefit from additional research and from additional time listening to the community and what they think the costs are to their livelihoods as well.
Yeah, I had mentioned part one of this series, we had talked with Susan Gordon of MACE, and she had talked about what a challenge it was just to get this study funded, and it took years. And obviously for many reasons we're glad that she was able to get that done, and hopefully things will work out. We'd like to do a part 3 eventually with some sort of legislator or someone who can tell us what the state decides to do as far as actions based on this report.
I think that would be incredible.
It's a very interesting subject. And honestly, as someone who's not from New Mexico, I didn't know any of this. I didn't know that there were uranium mines here. I didn't know that the people were suffering this way. And to hear all of this and, to listen to some of the presenters that I said I heard earlier in the week, I mean, it's shocking. There's a lot of potential here to help the state financially if we are able to move on this.
I agree completely. It's amazing to see that it's out of sight, out of mind, and that, for example, the largest nuclear disaster in US history happened in New Mexico just over 40 years ago and still has been only partially addressed.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, unless you have anything to add, I think that about wraps it up for us here at Enchanting Economics in New Mexico.
I just wanted to say thank you for having me here today to talk about it.
Don't forget to check us out at bber, that's bber.unm.edu, or on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube under @UNMBeaver. Thanks for listening, everyone. Take care.